Okay, so this is the sound of a solid state amp. And this is the sound of a tube amp. So I've spent a lot of my guitar playing life answering some pretty big questions as it pertains to guitar and just gear and just tone chasing in general. And one of the biggest of which that I've kept going back and forth for many, many years is solid state amps versus tube amps. Like, can the solid state amps actually compete with the tube amps? And I've had a lot of opinions over the years. Like I just said, there are times where I thought tube amps were just the way to go. There are times where I thought the digital world was just catching up. And I think I've finally come to a conclusion that I can be happy with. And I think that conclusion is that there's a lot of smaller questions you need to ask yourself before even attempting to answer that big question. Questions like, how loud do you want to get? How much do you want to spend? Does versatility matter? And the biggest question I think of all of them is, can you actually spot the difference, and how different do these things sound? So I was sitting here in this room, as I often do, and I was wondering, like, when am I actually going to put these things to the test? What are the differences between these two in the proper context? And that specifically came to my mind because I've been talking a very big game about the Boss Katana MKII artist head as recently, that I think people have really been sleeping on it. Not specifically the Boss Katana, because I know it's probably the biggest practice amp on the market right now, other than like the Yamaha THR, but the actual 100-watt amp head that they just released. I've loved it. I've wanted to use it for live gigs, for here in the studio recording, all of this stuff, but specifically seeing how it could stack up against a tube amp and seeing how it could hold its own, that's something that I haven't done before. And if I'm gonna talk a big game, I might as well see how it can do. And the other amp that I've recently acquired is this Supro Black Magic head, which is this wicked tube amp with a really cool history of how it was made. But we'll get more into that in a second. Right now, I just want to know what you think. I literally want to know. When I play you these back to back, what do you think of the sound? Start when it comes to the tube amp. Well, we'll start with this specific unit. It's one that I've wanted for like an entire year after playing it at my friend Andrew's house, and I talked about that in another video, by the way. Link to that in the description. Go check it out. I feel like there's an endless amount of surprise with pieces of gear that you have, where you keep discovering newer and newer things where you shouldn't actually be surprised, specifically in the clean tones. But with this amp in particular, once I got to that second channel, something that I hadn't really used the full capabilities of, that quick switch, was like all in. And it's definitely one of those things where you go in with your expectations, and it's very hard to like sort of capture the essence of this amp. The coolest thing about this amp in particular is just that it's actually modeled after the exact Supro that Jimmy Page would use. And yes, we are talking about that Jimmy Page, the Jimmy Page from that great band that you know from the 70s. You know that band Zed Zeppelin? Yeah, that band right there. I could tell instantly while comparing the two what this thing was trying to sound like and how specific that sound was trying to get. Because like I said before, the Katana is made to do so many things. And most digital amps like it are trying to also do many different things. But this thing right here, you're just like, that's straight Zeppelin. And you're just like constantly thinking to yourself like, hey mom, look, I'm Jimmy Page. So when it comes to solid state amps, and very specifically the Katana MK2 Artist Head that I've had for about 6 months, I think back to the point when I first opened it and brought it in this room, and there was like this weird level of excitement for getting a new piece of gear. Like, I think like every guitar player, I'm super excited whenever you get something new or get to try something new that you haven't tried before. But just because I was in my Katana era and I was really all about seeing what digital amps could do at the time, I was even so excited that I recorded a clip of myself literally playing through the Katana. I ran over to my friend's house, I showed him the clip, and I'm like, yo, this tone sounds fire, right? The Vox sounds good, right? And he was like, yeah, that sounds really good. That's one of the best tones you've ever gotten. I was like, I tricked you. That was the Katana. Never talk bad about this amp again. And when talking about it versus like the Supro or like in contention with a tube amp, I definitely had to tame a little bit of the high end with this. And I even specifically had to re-record a couple things. I had to play with a lot of the specific parameters, especially when it comes to like the contour button or really like dialing in that vintage setting or the global EQ. But I guess that's kind of why you would want a modeling amp. You'd want to be able to play with those specific parameters. And yes, it sounds digital, but I don't necessarily think something sounding analog means something sounds good and something sounding digital means something sounding bad. All right, so the cool thing about the experiment that I just did is actually our independent variable. And for those of you guys who sat in the back of class and watched Kobe Bryant highlights and failed most of the math tests you ever took in high school, our independent variable is our thing that will not change. It's our constant. And for me, that was the actual speaker cabinet that was coming out of it. What's cool is that both of these are not combo amps, that are amp heads. So putting them against each other, I could make sure they were coming out of the exact cab unit using the aux box, which is my main simulator. So I was trying to change as little as possible to see what the actual amp head unit sounded like with as few differing variables as possible. Now that being said, the clean tone was still really hard to match up, because from the first time that I opened the Supro, what I found even doing the review is that this amp gets crunchy even on like the clean setting on that first channel. I didn't really know what to do with the Katana. Do I go lower gain on the crunch setting? Do I go higher gain on the clean setting? And seeing exactly how I could try and match it up. But once it got to the crunchier tones and trying to get the dirtier settings, I just went to the crunch and was able to match up easier. Now, the big question, I'm not here to lie to you, but tell me in the comments exactly what you thought when you heard both of the tones. And one of the other things that I've heard people talk about more recently is just like the actual consideration of what style of music you're playing. What would be more appropriate in the moment? I think for like something like blues rock, a lot of stuff that I play, tube amps are generally more preferable. But for some of the like polyphia stuff that I've been learning more recently, they use digital stuff all the time, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I've ever gotten better tones than Tim Henson, because his stuff sounds unbelievable, but that's also a different unit entirely from the Katana. So you have to take all those things into account. But again, I want to know what you think. What did you think of the specific tones coming out of the Katana, coming out of the Supro? Have you used either of which amps? And most importantly, what determines for you specifically whether you went with a tube amp or a solid state amp when you were figuring out what to do with your guitar playing? Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Tried to see what my amp heads could do, really push them a little bit to see how far they could get, how close it to get to the tube amps. If you want to know anything more about the Supro or the Katana, I got them both from Sweetwater. Links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of those pieces of gear. Make sure to check out those links. Like and subscribe if you had a good time. And most importantly, like most important of all, have a fantastic day. I wanna get it right this time. I wanna get it right this time.